We now spend some time with Lamorna Spry, who tells us about Cornwall and the Great Migration.
Cornwall and the Great Migration. In the 19th century, Cornwall experienced what is now known as the Great Migration, when Cornish men and women left their homes to work and build communities in places like South Africa, USA, South America, Australia and India. Farmers, miners, clay workers could all offer valuable skills to the New World and developing countries. Many were escaping economic hardship and would never see Cornwall again. The mass migration continued right up until the early 20th century, when it was largely halted by the First World War. So why did so many Cornish men and women leave their homes for life overseas? Remember that most of these, often impoverished people, had never left their local communities before, let alone travel across oceans. My grandfather, who left in 1911, had barely travelled further east than Penzance when he set sail for Quebec and eventually California. In the early 19th century, the skills of the Cornish were so highly valued that, when Peru was trying to restore its mines, they sent emissaries to Cornwall to persuade engineers and miners to help them. In an 1831 newspaper article, the Royal Cornwall Gazette lamented the number of skilled workers forced to emigrate due to overpopulation and poverty. Their correspondent pleaded with the government, saying, "Prevent the best of our sons leaving these shores." We would refer to it now as a brain drain. The Lord Chancellor of the time felt the answer lay in changes to the poor laws, but could not give any assurance as to when or how the laws could be amended. So very little was done over the course of the next 30 years, so that in each decade from 1861 to 1901, about a fifth of the Cornish male population migrated abroad, 3 times the average for England and Wales. The population of Cornwall in the second half of the 19th century hovered around the 350,000 mark. However, around 250,000 people left Cornwall during that time to work abroad. It is estimated that around 6 million people globally have Cornish ancestry. In Moontar, Australia, the Kernuic Lauender is the largest Cornish festival in the world and attracts tens of thousands of visitors each year. At one time in the 19th century, Padstow was the 3rd largest passenger port in the UK, only after Liverpool and London. And although miners made up many of the numbers, the emigrants also included farmers, merchants and tradesmen. The Cornish had quickly realised the opportunities promised by the discovery of gold, silver and copper across the globe, and being surrounded by the sea, they weren't afraid of taking long, treacherous journeys across oceans. Emigration offered the chance of better pay and conditions, and the opportunity to rise in society. In addition, the Cornish expertise in hard rock mining was second to none, and agents were employed by mining companies to recruit from the Cornish mines. Cornish engineering companies have been exporting machinery since the early 19th century. Richard Trevithick took his high-pressure steam engines to the silver mines of Peru in 1816. Now, to put this into context, this was only 11 years after the Battle of Trafalgar and 1 year after the Battle of Waterloo. Imagine ships like the Victory with sail and cannon, and then imagine the complexities of transporting a high-pressure steam engine across the Atlantic out to the wilds of Peru and then installing it in a working mine. But they succeeded. Such technology needed extremely talented men. Often men, never before out of their own village, would make hazardous foreign trips on their own before returning home to their families. Some left families behind, sending back money to support them. Others brought families out once they were settled, and many others married into the local communities. One of the untold stories of the 19th century emigration from Cornwall is that of the thousands of wives left behind by men leaving to work overseas. Known as married widows, these women single-handedly managed family and homes. They are the unsung heroes of many Cornish families, especially in the mining communities. Now, a Cornish miner who made these journeys became known in Cornwall as a Cousin Jack. Some say this was because they were always asking for a job for their Cousin Jack back home, whilst others think it was because the miners used to address each other by the greeting cousin, and Jack was short for John, which was the most popular Christian name in Cornwall at the time. Even in popular folk culture today, the saying goes that wherever there's a mine or a hole in the ground, you'll find a Cousin Jack at the bottom of it. And it wasn't just tin and copper that was mined. They were also mining tungsten, manganese, lead, zinc and arsenic. In fact, evidence of gold mines can be seen in the hills surrounding St Cleer. Now, the main migration really started around 1815. So let's set the scene. Science and engineering in Cornwall was flourishing. Sir Humphrey Davy, born in Penzance, had recently invented the miner's safety lamp and was Professor of Chemistry at the Royal Institution and was about to become the head of the Royal Society. Cornish scientists such as Goldsworthy Gurney were making global headlines, and Trevithick had revolutionised steam technology. John Couch Adams, who went on to discover the planet Neptune, would be born in Lan East in 1819. But much was also happening globally. After the American War of Independence, the early 1800s saw relations between Great Britain and United States still very strained. Britain remained at war with France. To rub salt into the wounds, American merchant vessels were regularly crossing the British blockades of French ports. But the Cornish were often at odds with the views of their government, so when the American schooner Packet of Boston sailed from Penzance on the 28th of September 1810, bound for New York, the stars and stripes were roundly cheered by onlookers as the sailing ship slipped from the quayside and made its way into the open waters of Mounts Bay. As one contemporary observer put it, this unusual outburst of exuberance demonstrated a Cornish cordiality towards the Americans. Among the passengers was James Hoskin, a Cornish farmer from near Castle and Dyness, who was quoted as not being unsympathetic to the aims of either the Americans or the French Revolution. He was tired of the restrictions and disabilities of life in Great Britain and wanted to build a new life in a land of civil and religious freedom, of social and economic mobility. However, the renewed war between Britain and the United States in 1812 put migration on temporary hold. And then in 1815, the Cornish had a new driving force to escape the land of their birth. The Corn Law was introduced to safeguard UK agriculture and the profits of landowners. But the effect on the poor was devastating, with the price of bread rocketing due to steep import taxes. With many families facing a future in the workhouse under terrible conditions, agricultural labourers and tenant farmers saw a way to escape their desperate poverty by travelling to the New World. Although large numbers were from North Cornwall, a number of families from the south around Liscard, including the Olvers, Tamblins, Penwardens, Bullocks, Hams, Bellamys, Hicks, Trevertons, Davies, Sprys and Orchards. Now, the mines of Latin America were amongst the first to attract Cornish miners overseas in the early 19th century. In fact, Latin America had started recruiting from Cornwall by the 1820s and continued to do so right up until the 1930s. Latin America's recognition of the Cornish as world leaders in engineering and mining not only provided the expertise to revive their own derelict mines, but also paved the way for the Cornish to export their technology and labour globally. Now, Mexico, for instance, has a long history of mining that dates back almost 500 years. During this time, its industry flourished, primarily in silver production, but also in gold, mercury and copper. However, by the early 19th century, Mexico's mines lay in ruins in the wake of the War of Independence from Spain in 1821. Santa Anna was ruling Mexico, and Texas was still part of Mexico. And those of you who enjoy singing shanties will be familiar with the shanty Santa Ana, which tells the story. At the time Texas became independent in 1836, Mexico considered the mining industry to be the cornerstone of economic success and looked to Cornwall to provide the capital, technology and skilled labour to revive its once great industry. So at this stage, in the early part of the 19th century, cousin Jacks were being enticed and pulled to the New World. The region of Real del Monte near Pachuca in the state of Hidalgo, Mexico, boasted many rich silver mines. And by the 1830s, a large Cornish community had established itself, the majority of these migrants coming from Cambourne and Redruth. In fact, Cambourne is now twinned with Pachuca. It is said when emigration was at its peak, up to 50% of working-age Cornishmen struggling against poverty left their homes and families for the promise of a new life on a far continent. At the end of the 19th century, about £1 million a year was being sent back to Cornwall just from the Transvaal in South Africa alone. The Cornish introduced a number of leisure activities to Mexico, including traditional Cornish hymn singing and Cornish wrestling. And it was Cornish miners who introduced football to Mexico. The country's first football club, Pachuca Athletic Club, originally comprised exclusively of Cornish mine workers. And to this day, the city of Pachuca still prides itself as being the home of Mexican football and possibly the Mexican wave. Cornish miners also introduced the Cornish pasty to Mexico, and versions of the dish made with chili peppers, known as pastis, are still considered a local speciality. The area of Pachuca and Real del Monte is now marketed as Mexico's Little Cornwall. But let's move on a bit in time now. The period from 1845 to 1851 is often called the Hungry Forties, with Ireland experiencing the Great Potato Famine. But Cornwall also suffered from the potato blight, but wholesale famine was averted because the Cornish were at least allowed to grow grain. But it still caused excessive hardship and a surge in the Cornish desperate to leave for Canada and the United States. In 1848 there was a severe outbreak of cholera in West Cornwall, followed by a smallpox epidemic. And at that time, the average age span for the Cornish was a mere 28 years in West Cornwall. Little wonder then that when gold was discovered in California that same year, many people took the opportunity to chance their hand. But different parts of Cornwall fared much better than others. For instance, in the 1840s, Red Ruth was incredibly wealthy and was quoted as having one of the highest GDPs, not just in Cornwall, but in the whole of Europe. Meanwhile, what was happening in Looe? In Looe, the concern was also about potatoes, but in relation to the state of the old, mainly wooden Looe Bridge. The Royal Cornwall Gazette reported on the 8th of May 1846 that several thousand tons of potatoes per day, mainly from Plint and Talland, are taken across the bridge by wagons and carts which shake the bridge terribly. Unbelievably, they say that 60 to 80 wagons pass and between 1,000 and 1,500 people every day go over the bridge in the potato season. And then I love this news story. In Plint, in August 1867, a Mary Barrett, 22, was charged with stealing a silk shirt, a chemise and 2 pillowcases, which were the property of Richard Scantlebury. When they searched her lodgings, they found the items amongst her clothes. Despite all the evidence against her, and also being undefended, the jury nevertheless found her not guilty. And so this brings me to a wonderful saying by the local Cornish writer, Sir Arthur Quiller Couch. He is quoted as saying, "With other juries, a crime is a crime. With a Cornish jury, you first have to explain that the alleged offence is illegal, then satisfy them that it ought to be illegal, then prove that the accused committed it. But then they will acquit, because the accused never had such a clear exposition of the law as they just enjoyed." So again, what about Looe? In 1851, in his book Rambles Beyond Railways, Wilkie Collins describes Looe as singularly beautiful and one of the prettiest and primitive places in England. He wrote, "We stayed at the cleanest of inns, where we are welcomed by the kindest of landladies and waited on by the fairest of chambermaids. Succulent was our supper in these halls of plenty." Looe Harbour was also very productive. The Royal Cornwall Gazette correspondent in 1858 describes boats taking granite from the cheese ring quarries to build Westminster Bridge. He also noted that Looe and the surrounding villages had doubled their population in the previous 50 years. In 1859, Brunel completed the crossing of the Tamar with the Prince Albert Bridge, which should have brought more prosperity to Cornwall, but unfortunately it coincided with the collapse of mineral mining due to cheap imports from places such as Malaysia. Despite there being over 1,500 mining companies in Cornwall in the latter half of the 19th century, the heyday for Cornwall was over. Let's just take that in. 1,500 mines. Vast swathes of Cornwall would have been industrialised, with clouds of belching smoke from all the chimney stacks dominating the landscape. It is said that even the sea ran red. But as I said before, gold had been discovered in California, and the Cornish didn't waste time in travelling there. In 1880, an American commentator observed that New Almondon was the prettiest, neatest, cleanest and most cheerful mining village they'd ever visited. Looking down from Mine Hill into the valley, it was mostly Cornish. From nearly every house we hear music and singing, in which the Cornish so much delight. But meanwhile, back in Cornwall, things were looking pretty bleak. The great blizzard had struck in 1891 and cholera was still rife. At the beginning of this talk I posed the question, what was the background to the Great Migration? Now I hope I've answered some of that and why Cornish communities are still very evident globally in USA, Canada, Chile, Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Australia,